The British redcoats of the American Revolution. Often mocked, undervalued, or by Hollywood portrayed as red-coated imperial stormtroopers with a hatred of freedom-loving American rebels. Splitters. In the last episode we looked at who they really were. Were they the proverbial scum of the earth? Did they receive any training? How old were they generally, and how many years service did they have? In today's short episode we're joined once more by author and historian Robbie MacNiven to explain how British infantry battalions were structured and organised. Let's get stuck in.
I can use regiment and battalion interchangeably in this period because often they're the same thing. There aren't very many regiments that have multiple battalions in the Revolutionary War. Most of them, Highland regiments tend to because they recruit very heavily. There's a lot of recruits for Highland regiments during this period, so they can often form two battalions. But for the most part, a regiment is just one battalion, so you can kind of just, it's the same thing. So one battalion in this time consists of 10 companies, and 8 of those are what they called hat companies. So they're kind of regular companies, the ordinary soldiers. 2 are flank companies, and these are the slightly more elite companies of the regiment. They're called flank companies because they're deployed on the flanks when the regiment's drawn up in line. So one's on the right and one's on the left. And they are divided into the Grenadiers and the light infantry. So the right-hand company are the Grenadier company, and the concept behind them is that they are the tallest, strongest, bravest, boldest, most heroic men in the regiment. Historically, the name comes from when they would actually be equipped with grenades, sort of crude little black steel balls filled with gunpowder, and they'd be expected to lob those as they attacked fortifications. But that wasn't the case by the mid-18th century. Grenades weren't really reliable in this period and kind of were as much a danger to the guy using them as the person it was meant to hit. So they kind of phased grenades out of being used except in very rare and exceptional circumstances. So Grenadiers didn't actually have grenades, but they were still considered the tallest, the best, strongest. A newer addition is the company on the left flank, which is the light infantry company, and they're kind of supposed to be the opposite, but in a good way. So they were, on paper, the shortest and the leanest and the fittest, and the best shots and the most individualistic and sort of capable of acting on their own initiative, and they don't have to just depend on the orders of an officer. And they were expected to be able to fight separated from the rest of the battalion and in skirmish order, so spread out and engaging basically enemy skirmishers. It was a fairly new concept in the army. Light infantry companies had only come into being a couple of decades earlier during the 7 Years' War, specifically the French and Indian aspect of the 7 Years' War, so the fighting that Britain and France were doing in North America in that period, and to some extent still in the Revolution. North America was still pretty heavily forested, kind of still a wilderness area, and it wouldn't have made any sense to deploy in a close formation in a big line in a forest or in a gully or in rocky terrain or stuff like that. It makes a lot more sense for people to spread out, use trees for cover, and kind of fight more individualistically. So the British accepted that, and they modified their tactics, and they introduced the concept of the light infantry company, partly modelled on the way Native Americans were fighting in the period, because they're the masters of this kind of what we might now think of as guerrilla warfare. So the light infantry were expected to be able to do that and to operate that way. The American colonists had also attained the ability to fight like that, again mostly because of contact with Native Americans. So light infantry companies were very important in the Revolution, and the British embraced this style of warfare to a great degree. So yes, the light company make up the left flank of the regiment, and together there's 10 companies. The size of the company varied throughout the war. It got progressively bigger. So at the start of the war, I think it's 36 enlisted men, and then a couple of NCOs and an ensign, a lieutenant, a captain.
Oh, that is small, yeah.
Yeah, so that's the peacetime size, because the army was deliberately cut down after the 7 Years' War in order to try and save costs. So yeah, the army was very small, and even the light infantry companies were abolished for about a decade after the end of the 7 Years' War, and it's only in the 1771-ish that light companies were actually brought back. Again, that was just to save money. So it starts off small, and then it rapidly starts to escalate. So For most of the war, it's about 50 men. By the end of the war, it's just over 60. That's on paper, so obviously it varies in terms of the actual amount in a combat theatre. But say an average of about 50, they're aiming for about 50. And yeah, that would be the size of a single company. And that's the same for the Grenadiers. Grenadiers, light infantry, and regular hat companies. So during the Revolution, in natural North America, in combat, the flank companies were often detached to form battalions entirely dedicated to that particular type of soldier. So all of the Grenadier companies from, say, 10 regiments in an army would be detached from their parent regiment, gathered together, and they would form basically a regiment of Grenadiers, just on an operational level for that campaign. And the same was done with the light infantry. So the light infantry company would be detached and they could form a light battalion that could then operate entirely in skirmish order, things like that. And this was a bit controversial because it created elite regiments, basically, extremely effective regiments, but then it also robbed the original regiments of some of their best men. So it also shrunk the size of the regiment. You can see in this image that there's 8 companies present here. These are the 8 hat companies, the 8 regular companies, the ordinary soldiers. And this is the 33rd, is depicted at the Battle of Camden. So their Grenadier and their light company had been detached by this point and had been sent off to the composite battalions of Grenadier and light infantry. And it just left behind sort of the remainder, the ordinary troops who, you know, they still function very well, but not all the officers are too pleased that they're losing 2 companies from a regiment. So that's a quirk of operational and campaigning history in North America specifically.
Okay guys, if you like the history of the American Revolution, then be sure to subscribe, because in the next episode Robbie is going to talk us through the elite 33rd Regiment of Foot and all of their battles during the conflict. You won't want to miss it. I'll see you then.